Not every day do you witness a convicted murderer rebuilding their reputation and returning to court, demanding the conviction of their accuser. But that's exactly what happened in this high-profile case, raising questions about the power wielded by prosecutors and what happens when they abuse it. At the center of this story is a man named Michael Morton. He was once an ordinary American, a model family man, and a reliable worker. But then he was sent to prison for the rest of his life. On August 12, 1986, Michael Morton turned 32 years old. He lived in Williamson County, Texas, with his wife, Christine, and their 3-year-old son, Eric. The family had a well-maintained home, a manicured lawn, a small porch in the backyard, and a dog, a perfect example of an ideal family. The Mortons went through a tough ordeal when Eric was diagnosed with a congenital heart defect, and they had to wait until he turned 3 to undergo surgery. Fortunately, the surgery was more than successful, and the dark cloud that had hung over Michael and Christine for these years had now dissipated. On that day, they drove to Austin to celebrate Michael's birthday. The evening went wonderfully, and after dinner, Michael naturally wanted to spend the night alone with Christine. However, she was very tired from putting Eric to bed and asked her husband to wait until the following evening. Michael got up at 5 a.m., washed up, shaved, and left a note for Christine on the bathroom mirror. At 6 a.m., he clocked in for work at the supermarket. A little later, their neighbor noticed Eric walking on the lawn all by himself, completely dirty in his diaper. She realized he was alone and took the boy home, calling for his mother. However, there was no response from her. The neighbor searched the house for Christine and found her in the bedroom. She had been brutally murdered, blood was everywhere, on the walls and even the ceiling. The neighbor was overwhelmed with horror and immediately called the sheriff's office, and they promptly arrived at the crime scene. Sheriff John Boutwell was well known to everyone in his cowboy hat, boots, and a tie clip that resembled handcuffs. The sheriff began searching the house without even informing Michael of his wife's death. There were no signs of forced entry, robbery, or violence. Christine lay on her back in bed, her face so disfigured by blows that she was unrecognizable. The murder weapon was likely a wooden plank from the backyard, as indicated by the splinters found in her brain. The killer had delivered approximately 10 blows, though 1 or 2 would have been sufficient. Afterward, they placed a blue suitcase and a woven basket on Christine. Meanwhile, Michael had gone to pick up his son from daycare only to find Eric missing. He called home and was answered by the sheriff, who informed him of his wife's murder. When Michael arrived home, he cooperated with the police, explaining that he had been at work and had no knowledge of what had happened. However, from the note he had left, it seemed there had been a disagreement about intimacy, and he had been rejected on his birthday. The note roughly read, "I didn't want to fight over this, but you denied me on my own birthday. See you tonight." Investigators repeatedly interrogated Michael and spoke with all his neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances, trying to understand who he was. His relatives couldn't comprehend why they were scrutinizing Michael when they should have been searching for the faceless monster who had truly committed this horrendous crime against Christine. Michael became the primary and only suspect, and shortly after saying his farewells to Christine, he heard a knock on the door. He picked up Eric and went to answer it. There stood the sheriff with his deputies. They forcibly took the child from his father's arms and arrested the man. Eric reached out to his dad, calling for him and crying. He had just lost his mother, and now his father was taken away. The trial began less than 6 months after the arrest, which was remarkably fast for a murder case. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Ken Anderson, who acted assertively and even aggressively. However, he was also intelligent and extremely charismatic. He not only possessed excellent legal skills, but also had a knack for influencing the emotions of the jurors. The prosecution claimed that Michael wanted to end his unhappy marriage and killed Christine in a fit of rage because she had refused to be intimate with him on his birthday. One of the key pieces of evidence was a note from Michael, which supposedly was meant to prove that Christine was alive when he left home. But there were other pieces of evidence as well. They found hair in her hand, and there were traces of seminal fluid on the bed. A forensic pathologist examined the contents of Christine's stomach and the rate of digestion, concluding that the attack on the victim had occurred shortly before Michael left for work. The defense had only one strategy: that a maniac committed the murder, capable of doing this to anyone. Michael couldn't be considered the ideal emotional witness. He was composed and intelligent, not displaying excessive emotion. Sometimes he even appeared stern, but this couldn't be a basis for his conviction. The prosecutor waited for the closing arguments, knowing that the defense attorney had no rebuttal. Standing before the families of Christine and Michael, in front of his own mother, he declared that after Michael killed Christine, he had taken pleasure in defiling her. Michael's relatives could barely contain their anger, feeling the urge to defend him. But Anderson didn't stop there. He showed the jurors gruesome photographs from the crime scene, depicting pools of blood, and said, "Don't let him get away. If he is released, we are all in danger." The jurors deliberated briefly and found Michael Morton guilty, sentencing him to life in prison. Anderson couldn't resist even then, and stated that the punishment was too lenient and Michael should have been executed. After 11 months of Michael's sentence, 32-year-old Deborah Baker didn't show up at work. Her boss called her mother to inquire about her whereabouts. The woman went to Deborah's home, calling her daughter's name, but receiving no response, she entered her bedroom. What she saw was a gruesome scene. Everything was covered in blood, indicating a brutal attack. Deborah had suffered several incredibly powerful blows to her head before being smothered with pillows. It's terrifying to imagine what the mother had to go through upon discovering her daughter in such a state. The injuries on Deborah's arms suggested that she had tried to defend herself against her assailant. She was lying partially on her side and partially on her stomach. While this could be indicative of violence, the pathologist did not confirm it. Crime scene investigators found hairs on the bed and a blue towel on the bathroom floor. This might indicate that the perpetrator tried to eliminate evidence or took a shower. Jewelry boxes were open, but their contents remained untouched. The only things missing from Debbie's house were a videocassette recorder, a small amount of money from her purse, and the clothing that the assailant likely wrapped the VCR in. It is likely that the intruder gained entry through the glass door at the back of the house. On the day of Deborah's murder, her sister came to visit. Deborah's 2 children were with their father and sister, peacefully drinking coffee and chatting when suddenly they heard a noise. Deborah's sister asked what it was, and Deborah replied that a window had broken, and she had covered it with a garbage bag to keep the cold out. Deborah's sister thought she heard the sound coming from the closet, but didn't argue about it. After Deborah's death, the thought that the killer had hidden in the closet and waited for her to leave haunted her. From the beginning of the investigation, the detectives focused on Deborah's ex-husband, Phil. According to their developing theory, he did not want to share custody of the children, especially since he lived nearby, and his fingerprints were found in approximately 15 places in the bedroom and bathroom. Of course, he denied everything and passed a polygraph test. At first, Deborah's sister did not mention the true reason for the divorce, but she couldn't remain silent when the police began to seriously suspect the man. The family fell apart because Phil admitted to having a non-traditional orientation to Deborah. They separated as friends. The children lived with their father for a week and with their mother for a week. In reality, Phil did not want full custody of the children. He enjoyed his life, went on dates, and did what he had always dreamed of. Having 2 kids would have made it difficult. Only after this did the investigators truly turn their attention to the case and started looking for other suspects. Deborah didn't have any relationships with anyone else because she divided all her time between work and the children. The police compared fingerprints in the house with samples from 52 people, checked all suspicious individuals living nearby, and provided the serial number of the video cassette recorder to pawn shops. The investigators had no other leads to pursue, and a shroud of mystery enveloped this case. According to the court order, Eric could visit his father once every 6 months. His visits were arranged by his sister, Kristen, who now took care of the boy. For Michael, these meetings were like a breath of fresh air, but over time, his son began to distance himself from him. In his teenage years, Eric decided that he didn't need these visits anymore. During their last visit, without looking Michael in the eyes, Eric said he wouldn't come anymore. The devastated father asked his daughter-in-law to take care of his son and left. What was supposed to be a 2-hour meeting ended in just 2 minutes. Michael admits that he went through hell. His wife was killed, and he himself was sentenced to life in prison. But that didn't break him. He thought he could handle it all. However, losing his son was the final blow for the man. By 2002, Michael Morton had spent 14 years in prison. Despite filing appeals, they were consistently rejected. However, in 2002, his attorney, who had been providing pro bono assistance all this time, shared Michael's story of innocence with the staff of the Innocence Project, an organization dedicated to securing the release of wrongfully convicted inmates. In 2004, the Innocence Project asked John Rayleigh to examine the case. He immersed himself in it and began with Michael's notes. If Michael had truly murdered his wife and wanted to cover it up with a note, the last thing he would have written about would be a disagreement with Kristen. That's absurd. There was no other evidence against him. He had passed 2 polygraph tests, and the forensic examiner had examined the body only after 2 days, which prevented the determination of the time of death based on rigor mortis, or lividity. He drew conclusions solely based on the contents of the stomach, despite medical literature categorically prohibiting this. What couldn't be used as evidence became the primary reason for the jury to doubt. There was clearly insufficient grounds for conviction, but it was still too early to talk about innocence. In the list of evidence, an blood-stained bandana was mentioned. Kristen's brother, who was dissatisfied with the progress of the investigation, went on his own search for evidence and found this bandana on a construction site approximately 100 meters behind the house. He went to the sheriff and forced them to accept the bandana as evidence. Blood was found on it, but DNA analysis was not available at that time. As a result, the bandana was stored away and forgotten. Of course, John Rayleigh wanted to conduct DNA analysis. The fabric could potentially contain Kristen's blood, mixed with sweat, skin cells, or the hair of the perpetrator. If they could find a match in the federal DNA database, they could identify the killer. It seemed like a straightforward process, but the sheriff's office refused to show the bandana, flatly denying access to it. In February 2005, John filed a motion for DNA analysis. If approved, they would have to release the evidence for testing. District Attorney John Bradley ignored the motion for 10 months. He repeatedly asked for extensions to respond, and always received consent. Over the years, Ken Anderson's legal powers expanded. In 2002, the governor appointed him as a federal judge for Williamson County. His position as the district attorney was taken over by his deputy, John Bradley. They would never have agreed to cooperate with Michael Morton's defense attorneys, as it could have cast a negative light on their mentors, friends, and colleagues. However, John Rayleigh's father was a former prosecutor, and he advised his son to call Bradley and explain everything to him. John did just that. He told Bradley that the search for the truth could not lead to anything bad. Either Michael was where he belonged, or he was innocent, and the real killer had been free all this time. John Rayleigh couldn't believe his ears when Bradley refused to allow the bandana to be tested, claiming that DNA analysis would muddy the waters. The first hearing regarding the DNA analysis took place 3 years after the initial request and failed because Bradley did not want it. The prosecutor didn't even make a presentation. Everything seemed orchestrated. Rayleigh tried to talk to John Bradley once more. Bradley said he would allow testing on a hair found on Kristen's hand if the attorneys dropped everything else, including the bandana. Rayleigh, of course, refused. Michael had slept in the same bed and the hair was most likely his. The outcome of the case depended on the bandana. 2 days later, Michael called his attorney. He said they could release him, but only if he confessed to the murder. He had already served 22 years. His parents had aged, and his son had not been heard from. Whoever had condemned him, he would confess to the murder for the sake of his release. However, Michael said that all he had left was his innocence, and he would hold on to it even if he remained in prison. Rayleigh, who had contemplated dropping the case himself before, promised not to give up and vowed to prove his innocence with God's help. In 2010, Rayleigh presented the case in the appellate court for the 3rd time. The legal battle had already lasted 6 years in both the federal and appellate courts. During this time, John Bradley secured one of the seats on the Texas Forensic Commission and, in the same week, became its chairman. This individual used his influence to prevent Rayleigh from conducting DNA analysis. Now, he was heading the state's Forensic Commission. While judges were deliberating, John Bradley turned to the press and granted an interview. He stated that if Michael Morton promised to admit guilt in case of ambiguous results, he would allow the DNA test. He continued to toy with the fate of a living person. Despite Bradley's efforts, this time the court approved the forensic analysis. Michael Morton had spent 24 years in prison when, in June 2011, the results of the tests came in. The blood on the bandana belonged to Kristen Morton. It was mixed with the sweat and skin cells of a man, but not her husband. When Michael was informed of these results, he was overjoyed, but the process could still take some time. They needed to run the DNA sample from the man through the federal database in the hope of finding a match with a known offender in the database. On August 13, 2011, the answer came in. The DNA belonged to Mark Allen Norwood, a man who had been in prison on multiple occasions. Remarkably, John Bradley still opposed Michael's release, insisting that the bandana was insignificant and coming up with wild theories. According to one of these theories, Michael had found the bandana after his wife's murder, put on gloves, smeared the fabric with his wife's blood, and then returned it. This theory was far-fetched. Fortunately, the process was now unstoppable, and Michael's innocence was becoming increasingly evident. In September 2011, the Innocence Project's request for the release of the full case files was finally approved. These files had been kept secret for 25 years, and when John Rayleigh finally reviewed them, he saw that the evidence of Michael's innocence had been right in front of the district attorney all this time, but it had been concealed. There was a clear footprint on the ground in front of the Mortons' house, but no plaster cast had ever been made. Unknown fingerprints were left on the glass door, but they were never investigated. A neighbor had seen a suspicious man park a green van and walk towards the wooded area behind the Mortons' house, where the bandana had been found. On August 15th, a store in San Antonio, Texas, reported to the police that someone had illegally used Kristen Morton's credit card. But the main piece of evidence that shocked the attorney was from the day Eric bid farewell to Kristen. Eric had a conversation with his grandmother, who had the insight to record every word the boy said. And there was a lot to record. "Mommy is crying. She's screaming, asking him to leave. Why is she crying? There's a monster here. What is he doing? Hurting her? Is she still crying?" No, she stopped. The mean monster put a blue suitcase on the bed. Did he hurt her? Yes. The boy said that the monster had red hands and big mustaches. And now, the main moment. Where was Daddy Eric? Was he there? No, Mommy and Eric were there. All of this had been in their documents from the very beginning. The information had been hidden from the defense, the court, and the jury. They knew Michael had done nothing, but they sent him to prison for life. And the killer of his wife had been set free to potentially harm again. As John Rayleigh delved into Norwood's past, he found a case that bore a striking resemblance to Kristen's murder. The victim's name was Deborah Baker. It was necessary to report this coincidence to the authorities, but there was no trust in Williamson County. So the attorney turned to Travis County, where Deborah had been killed. Pubic hairs found on her bedspread, along with a blue towel from her bathroom, were sent to the lab. The results confirmed that Mark Allen Norwood had killed Deborah Baker. He was arrested on November 9, 2011. Ken Anderson decided to preemptively hold a press conference. Deborah's adult daughter and her aunt also attended. Anderson apologized, but not for his actions. Instead, he shifted all the blame onto a system error and left, refusing to answer questions. At that moment, Deborah's daughter directly accused him of letting a serial killer go, giving him the opportunity to kill her mother, and added that if he genuinely regretted it, he should prove it by resigning. After a significant turn in Deborah's case, the authorities had little room to maneuver, and public opinion was increasingly turning against them. People couldn't understand why Michael was still in prison. On October 4, 2011, after 25 years of incarceration, Michael Morton was finally released. He couldn't believe what was happening and savored every moment of his newfound freedom. However, 2 years later, he had to return to the courtroom, but this time as a witness in Norwood's trial. Mark Norwood was found guilty of 2 murders and sentenced to 2 life imprisonments. In 2013, Texas passed the Michael Morton Act, which required prosecutors to disclose all case materials to the defense and keep track of evidence. People like Ken Anderson had hidden evidence for years, wrongfully convicted innocent individuals, and allowed murderers to roam free. This act was the most revolutionary change in the state's legislation in 50 years. Anderson's actions triggered an unprecedented investigation, and he ultimately lost his title as an attorney and spent 6 days in jail. John Bradley was not re-elected as the district attorney. Sheriff Boutwell was never charged because he passed away from cancer. Michael Morton received nearly $2 million from the state. John Rayleigh arranged another pleasant surprise for him, a reunion with his son. When the DNA analysis results came in, it became evident that Michael hadn't killed his wife, and the attorney reached out to Eric. This case demonstrates how dependent the justice system is on the honesty of the police and prosecutors, and how easily people are willing to trust them. Jurors and the public accepted an unbelievable and even absurd motive for the murder as presented by the prosecutor because they didn't want to believe that a murderer was walking free. In reality, they should have been afraid of two evils: Norwood, who was killing people, and the police, who were wrongfully accusing the innocent. It's easy to believe in guilt when there are no pieces of evidence for an alternative theory of the crime. In this case, such evidence existed. It just wasn't shared with the defense.